Welcome to Highline Excel 2016 class video number 6. Hey, if you want to download this Excel file, Business 218 Video 6 Start file, or the PDF files, click on the link below the video. Wow, we got all sorts of amazing topics in this video. Here's the PDFs, 14 pages of amazing notes. Here's our Excel workbook, and here are our topics. We're actually going to talk about conditional calculations with Excel formulas. Now, we did a little bit of conditional calculations with Excel formulas back in video 2, and we did a lot of conditional calculations with pivot tables in video number 3. But here, we got to talk about formulas. We got to talk about an AND logical test using AND criteria, the OR logical test using OR criteria, and there's a bunch of different ways to do both types of logical tests. Most of the time when we're doing data analysis or formulas with calculation, we're using either the AND logical test or OR logical test. So we're going to see a bunch of different ways and a bunch of different methods for making these types of calculations with formulas. Then we're going to talk about credit analysis for accounts receivable. We'll talk about the if and is functions and even compare and contrast pivot tables and formulas. Now I want to jump over to our PDF notes, and in the table of contents, I want to click on AND logical test. Now, the goal of an AND logical test is to run 2 or more logical tests and see if all logical tests evaluate to true. You can think of it like this. If you take out the garbage and clean the table, you get dessert. It's only if you get 2 trues, took out the garbage, and cleaned the table, that you get dessert. An AND logical test might look like this. Only one of these will deliver from the logical test a true. It's only when we get 2 trues. Now, I want to jump over to Excel, and we want to go to the sheet and our first example of an AND logical test, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, and criteria. That means we're going to be asking a question of each record in the data set. Only when we get 1, 2, 3 trues are we allowed to count or include the number in our calculation. Now, the question is, for this set of AND criteria, is the region South and is the sales rep GG and is the product DAB? If I'm doing this manually, that means I have to look through the region column. I have to ask, is this equal to South? False. Is this equal to South? True. I have to continue for the entire column. Then I switch over to the next criteria on the next column. Is this equal to GG? True. Is this equal to GG? True. Continue all the way down. Then I jump over and get my product. Is this equal to DAB? False. Is this equal to DAB? False. All the way down. It's only when I get 1, 2, 3 trues that I get to use that record in any calculations. Now, before we start doing adding, counting, averages, and other calculations, let's look at the AND function. If I type equals AND, tab, notice logical 1, logical 2, up to 255 logical tests. For us, we have 3. Now, and its only purpose is to deliver a true or false. We can put as many logical tests. Only when they all come out true will and deliver a true. All right, so we're going to build our logical test as a new column to indicate that this record should be included. I'm going to ask the question, hey, is the item for this record in region, are you equal to South? And I'm going to lock that with the F4 key. Now look at the screen tip. I type comma, and now I get my next logical test. I'm asking of this record in the sales rep column, are you equal to, down here, GG, our criteria, and F4. Now we have 2 logical tests, comma, and our third one is, hey, is the product for this record equal to DAB? And I'm going to hit the F4 key. Now we have our 3 logical tests, close parentheses, Control Enter. It better deliver false because I have false, true, false. When I double click and send it down, sure enough, I get trues only when 1, 2, 3 conditions have been met. Now, when would you want to use the AND function? Well, sometimes people use the AND function in a helper column like this to help them with complex criteria when they're filtering or building formulas. Other times, we use and the OR functions inside the if function. And we'll see a great example of that for our accounts receivable problem later. All right, now we want to go talk about SUMIFs, COUNTIFs, and average-ifs. These are built-in functions that add, count, and calculate the average based on one or more conditions. And guess what? The default for these functions is AND criteria. So if we enter multiple criteria ranges and criteria, all these functions run an AND logical test to then either add, count, or calculate an average. Now, before we make our calculations, I actually would like to use defined names in our formulas instead of always having to come over and highlight these columns. So we're going to use the create names from selection trick. I've highlighted the field names, Control-Shift down arrow to highlight all the way down to the bottom. We could go up to formulas, define names, create from selection, but there's a keyboard for this, Control-Shift F3. Now we have to be careful when we create names from selection. Top row, I definitely want to use the word at the top of each column, the first row, as the name for each column, but I do not want left column. If I use left column, it would name each row this date, and we don't want that. So I click OK. Now instantly from our name box, we can see there's customer, there's region, and so on. Now let's come over, and our first calculation is total cost of goods sold. Since I'm adding with multiple conditions, I use the SUMIFs functions. Now I can, in the sum range, highlight using a keyboard, Control-Shift down arrow, Control backspace, and it automatically puts our defined name in, comma. We have 1, 2, 3 different columns we have to put into criteria range. So the first column is region. I'm going to type it, region down arrow tab. I instantly see the range finder rainbow color coding shows me that's the right column. Comma. And the criteria, well, there it is. It's south. We're not copying this anywhere, so we don't need to lock it. Comma. Criteria range 2. So here's our second column. Sales rep, so I'm going to type S down arrow, and we can see our gold. Dog tags mean define name. F of X means function. I hit tab, comma. There's Gigi for the criteria 2, comma. Criteria range, that's our third column. Product, I see the gold dog tag, tab, comma. And there is DAB. So there we go. We've entered 3 criteria, 1, 2, 3, and 3 criteria ranges. 1, 2, 3. Anytime you add more than one criteria range and criteria, you are doing an AND logical test, in our case to add. So I hit enter, and boom, there it is. There's our total, 10,314. Now we want to calculate our average cost of goods sold next, because the average ifs function is very similar to the SUMIFs. The only difference is instead of saying sum range like it did up here for the numbers, our argument says average range. When you see average, remember that's the calculation we're making, average. When you see average range, it means please give me all of the numbers. We want our cost of goods sold column, so I type cost of goods sold or find it from my drop-down tab. Now we do the same 3 criteria ranges and criteria. Now, these arguments do not have to be entered in any particular order. It does not matter in which order we put them in, because all that matters is that there are 3 truths. I'm actually going to do the product one first. So product, tab, comma, and then I got my DAB product as the criteria, comma. Criteria range 2, that's going to be our sales rep, comma. And I'm going to go up and get my criteria, which is Gigi, comma. Criteria range 3, that's going to be region, tab. And now I go up and get my condition, which is south. So very similar, except for using average ifs instead of SUMIFs. When I control enter, there's our average, $3,064. Now, countifs is one argument easier than average ifs and sum ifs. If I want to count with these three conditions, there's no average or sum range. It's just criteria range 1, criteria range 2, and so on. Region, criteria range 1, comma, and there is the region south, comma, criteria range 2, sales rep, comma, and there's the sales rep GG, comma, and then product. That's criteria range 3, comma, and there's our product DAB. So simply put, 3 criteria ranges, 3 criteria, and you're good to go. And there it is, the count. There were exactly 36 transactions over in this data set where the region was south, sales rep was GG, and product was DAB. Now, in all 3 cases, we are doing single cell formulas. Sometimes we have a cross-tabulated report we need to create with formulas. So cross-tab, as we talked about when we were talking about pivot tables, it's as if there's a cross here, right? That intersecting cell right there, it has the column header criteria, sales rep Sheila, and it has the row header criteria, region west. And for every single calculation inside the table, it's the product DAB. Now we're going to use sum ifs tab. And what are we adding for the sum range? Cost of goods sold, comma, criteria range 1. It doesn't matter which range we put in first. I'm going to put in region. There's criteria range 1, comma. Criteria, notice this is the row header. As we copy the formula across our columns, we need it locked on J. But when we copy down, we need to move to J21, 22. So I hit F4 1, 2, 3 times, lock the column, but not the row. Comma, criteria range 2. This will be sales rep, comma, and our criteria is GG right here. As we copy the K19 down, it needs to be locked on K19. But as we copy the whole formula over from the GG column to Sheila and Mo, we want the K to move to L and then M. So I hit F4 1, 2 times to lock the row, but not the column. Comma, criteria range 3, that's product. And in this case, comma, criteria 3, that's going to be DAB. And I need it locked in all directions. Close parentheses. And so there's some ifs for a cross-tabulated table. Cross-tabulated table with 1, 2, and 3 and criteria. Now, one advantage of sum ifs and countifs and average ifs compared to the D functions that we'll learn a little bit later is that these functions can be copied easily down and over. We're allowed to have locked ranges, mixed cell references, whatever. When we get to our D functions, although they do more calculations than just adding, counting, and averaging, it's difficult to copy those formulas, but not for sum ifs. I can control enter, double click and send it down, copy it over, go to the diagonally furthest one away, hit F2, and admire that handiwork. The cell references and the defined names are all looking in the exact right position. So, and criteria for sum ifs, countifs, and average ifs, no problem. Now we want to go talk about a different type of and logical test. We want to talk about between logical tests. And this is just a form of an and logical test. And all it means is we're going to have a lower limit and an upper limit. And we need to either count how many of the transactions fell between January 1st, 2013 and January 31st. And then we need to add all the sales between this lower and upper date. Now, the trick in both of these formulas is going to be the comparative operator and how we join it to the lower and upper limit. Now, we're going to use countifs and sum ifs. But when we have our formula, we can't just click on this cell as the criteria, because then it would try to find just this day. And if we did and criteria, if I said, please go find a date over here that's the 1st of January and the last of January, there is no such date. So really what we want when we have an upper and lower limit and we're counting between is we need to say, please find all the dates greater than or equal to the lower date and less than or equal to the upper date. All right, let's try this with count ifs equals count ifs. The criteria range, it's going to be the date column, and we can see our gold dog tag there, date. Now, I'm going to have to repeat that date twice because there's two conditions. But for the first one, I'm going to put in the lower limit. Now, we need the comparative operator greater than or equal to. In double quotes, you have to put your comparative operator. In double quotes. Then you have to join it with Shift 7, the ampersand, to the actual date. Now, what this means is, notice the greater than or equal to sign is pointing towards the column. So it means it's going to be looking at all of the dates over there. And anytime it finds one that is greater than or equal to January 1st, 2013, it will get a true. Now we have to do the upper limit, and we have to repeat for criteria range 2, date. Now we do comma. Comparative operators are in double quote. And this is the upper limit. So every date has to be less than or equal to in double quotes, and then join it to the upper limit. Now notice, this whole comparative operator and date says I'm going to look at that column over there, and anytime I find one less than or equal to the end of January, I will get a true. It's only when we get 1, 2 trues that the date will be counted. Now I'm going to close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. I'm going to go to the last cell and hit F2 to verify. Sure enough, I got the upper and lower dates corrected over in our date column. I want to look at this 12/11/2013. Notice for this last count we're doing between the lower and upper limit, this is for December. So there's December 1st and December 31st. So if we look at this date right here, I have to get 2 trues. Is it true that 12/11/2013 is greater than or equal to 12/1/2013? The answer is true. Second, is this date less than or equal to December 31st, 2013? True. So because I got 2 trues, I'm allowed to count this transaction, and later we'll be able to use the numbers in our calculations. So in this situation, different than our first couple examples, our 2 questions are about the same column, and in particular, they're about the one date in this record. All right, so there we have counted between the lower and upper limit. Now let's do adding total sales. I'm adding with and criteria, so I'm going to do sum. If the sum range, I'm doing sales, comma, criteria range 1 is date. And now I have to do the same thing. The lower date always gets, hey, greater than or equal to in double quotes. And I'm going to join it to the lower limit, comma. Then I'm going to do my date column for criteria range 2, comma. And for criteria 2, in double quotes, less than or equal to in double quotes. And I'm going to join it to the upper date. We have to find a date that's greater than or equal to the lower, and less than or equal to the upper. Now it'll look through those transactions, close parentheses, Control Enter, and there's the total for January 2013. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell, F2. You could see how useful this type of formula is because it's often the case in business. We are adding sales or expenses or units for a month or a quarter or a year. Now, in this example here, we had our lower and upper limit. Sometimes we do not have that set up. So we want to look at a solution to this problem here. Please count all the transactions for the month, but we're only given the lower limit, and we're not allowed to add anything else to our spreadsheet. Well, we can do this. But first, let's consider a new function that can find the end of the month. And if you guess the name of this function, it's called EO month for end of month. All it needs is a start date, comma, and then you have to tell it how many months in the past or in the future you want to go to calculate the end of the month. Now, I want the current month, so you put 0. That means from this January 2013 date, I do not want to move any dates backwards or forwards. If I gave it -1, it would give me the end of the month for last month. Now that is a serial number. I'm going to right-click, point to my mini toolbar, click on Format Painter, and then click on this date, increase the column width. That is -1. It's looking at January, but it found the end of last month. If I give it a +1, it's going to find the end of next month. Notice it knows that there's only 28 days in February. F2, but what we want is 0. Control Enter, and that's the end of the month. We can actually use this formula element right inside our formula, and we'll join it to less than or equal to. Enter. Now I'm going to pretend that this isn't here. I'll leave it here as evidence that we did that, but we're going to pretend we're not allowed to use that. So you ready? We're counting. So I'm counting with and conditions or criteria. Count ifs. Date is our range, comma. We have a lower limit. So we say greater than or equal to, in double quotes, and join it to our lower limit. Now we do comma date. That's our criteria range 2. And then we need in double quotes less than or equal to, in double quotes. And we have to join it to. And now we do end of month. Notice the end of the month has no problem looking at the beginning of the month, comma 0 for the current end of the month, close parentheses. Now notice in criteria range 2, there it is, less than or equal to, and then some function determining automatically as we copy down the end of the month. Now I can close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell, F2. That is a useful construction because, again, oftentimes in many situations, not just business, you're counting or adding or averaging for a certain time period. Notice if we were doing quarters and I wanted to jump 2 months ahead to get the end of the month, I could put a 2 there. All right, let's escape. We want to talk about one other situation where we have between criteria. Here's our question. Our question is count the sales amounts that were between the upper and lower limit. So we want to count how many transactions from our data set were between 0 and $1,000, between 1,000 and 2,000, all the way to 10,000. Now I already looked through the data set, figured out what the minimum and maximum were, and then created my upper and lower limits so that when I count, I'm counting every single sales from that sales column. So you ready? But before we do this, we want to notice something here that's going to cause us to be careful when we create our comparative operators. If you have 0 and 1,000 for the first category, and you choose to have 1,000 and 2,000 for the second category, the fact that we have 1,000 in both places means we have to choose either the lower limit or the upper limit is going to get the equal sign. If we had greater than or equal to the lower limit and less than or equal to the upper and copied it down, we might double count because there would be an equal sign for both this 1,000 and this one. All right, so you ready? Equals count ifs. Criteria range, I'm doing sales because I want to look through the sales column and count between a lower and upper limit, comma. Criteria 1, in double quotes, greater than or equal to the lower limit. Now, I chose to put the equal sign on the lower side. In other situations, you might have the equal sign on the upper side. All right, so we've joined the lower limit to our comparative operator. Now I type a comma and then sales tab, criteria range 2, there we go, comma, and then for criteria 2, in double quotes, less than, I am not putting an equal sign, end double quote, and I'm joining it to the upper limit. Now I can close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell in F2. Sure enough, it looks like it's calculating correctly. Now let's look at this formula right here. Notice the lower and upper limit, 8,000 to 9,000, but 9,000 not included. If I go over to our data set, here is a single cell in this sales column, and we're asking 2 questions. Is this number greater than or equal to 8,000? The answer is true. Is it less than 9,000? The answer is true. This is an AND logical test. All the tests came out true. It's also a between logical test. All of the tests for the lower and upper limit both got true, so that 8,000 would be counted in this category. Now, one last thing about this formula right here. Notice we're counting between a lower and upper limit. If you remember last video, video number 5, we talked about the frequency array function. That frequency array function counts between a lower and an upper limit, but we're forced into categories that include the upper but not the lower. Now that's fine, and that solution actually is easier to create than this solution. We have to have the lower and upper, and we have to remember where the comparative operators go. But if you want control over your comparative operators, for example, you want the equal sign on the lower side, you can't do that with the frequency function. But here we can have any type of comparative operators for our upper and lower limit when we use COUNTIFs. All right, so that's 3 examples of between criteria. Now we want to talk about our next topic, D functions. Now, D functions are going to be special functions that only act on proper data sets with field names. And you have to set up the criteria with field names in the first row and the criteria below each field name. Now, when to use D functions? You can only use D functions when you have a proper data set, because the actual function communicates with the proper data set, the database, through field names like region, sales rep, product. In general, you don't want to use D functions if you need to copy, because it's difficult and in some situations completely impossible to copy a D function formula to another cell. And the reason why is because of this requirement that we have field names and criteria below. Another situation you might want to use D functions is when you have complex criteria, like lots of conditions. You can imagine using SUMIFs and COUNTIFs when you had to enter all these different ranges. And the other situation is you might not have a built-in function like SUMIFs and COUNTIFs. So up here, there's 12 different D functions. So sometimes calculating standard deviation or D max, that might be the only way to do it. All right, so let's see how to do this. Equal sign and a D. In our case, we want count. And there's 2 database functions, count counts number, count counts not empty cell. So I'm going to select count. Now notice the screen tip's pretty polite. It says, hey, give me the database, which is our proper data set. I'm going to use Control Home to jump up to cell A1. I'm going to highlight just the field names to sales, Control Shift down arrow to highlight all the way down to the bottom, and Control Backspace to jump back to the active cell. So that's our database, comma. Now the field, we have to tell D count, or whichever D function we use, which field we want to make a calculation upon. Now I'm going to count, and I chose count, so I have to choose one of the number columns. I'm going to choose sales. Now there's a couple ways we could communicate to the D function which field it is. I can put in double quotes sales, because that's the name of the field. I could have a cell reference, which I do right here, with the name of the field, or if you know the relative position, that means I went over and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Sales is the 7th field in that database. Any one of those 3 methods will work. I'm going to click on sales here. Now, comma, criteria. This is where we have to list our field names and our criteria below. Now, we have the choice between and or criteria. And criteria has to be on the same row. So notice the way we would read this is that the date has to be greater than or equal to 10/1/2013, and it has to be less than or equal to 12/31/2013, and the region has to be West, and sales rep GG and product AIM. Not only that, but you have to put the comparative operators right in the cell. All right, so here we go. Field names with and criteria all on the same row. Close parentheses and enter. So there are 7 transactions. Now I want to delete two of these conditions here, delete, and show you how we put that in. Now, normally we put a date like 12/31/2013 and hit enter. Well, that's a number, right? But we're required to put the comparative operator in. So I'm going to type it right before the 12, less than or equal to, and enter. So that's how you can enter date criteria. Now, watch what happens if I type equals West. Well, we already know what's going to happen. We've run into that problem multiple times in this class. That word is in a formula because equal sign is the first character in the cell. It's not in double quotes. It's not the name of a function, and it's not a defined name. So it will give us a name error if I hit enter. Here's the trick. When you're entering criteria for D functions or later, advanced filter uses the same criteria setup here. You put a lead apostrophe. Anytime you put a lead apostrophe in a cell, it says whatever comes after is considered text. And so when I hit enter, that's how we can put the criteria for find exactly West. Now I want to do total and average here. I'm going to cheat. Watch this. The actual arguments, database, name of the field we're calculating upon, and the criteria range is going to be exactly the same. So you ready? Control C and enter. Now we want a total, so we type DS. And notice there's standard deviation of the population, and sum. I want sum. And since all of these arguments are the same, I Control V and enter. And there is the total given our 5 conditions. Equals D average, tab, Control V. There's the database. There's the field we're going to try and calculate an average from. And there is our criteria, and enter. Now, all 3 of these calculations could be done with countifs, sumifs, and averageifs. But here's one you cannot do. If you needed to calculate standard deviation, there's not a equals stdev dot s if function. We wish there was one of those in statistics, but there's not. So instead, we're going to use equals D for database, S for standard deviation, and there it is. Now, the one without the P means sample, and the one with the P means population. Population is just all of them. Sample is a partial set from the population. All right, so Control V. This isn't a statistics class, so we're not studying what standard deviation means, but there you go. That's how we can calculate it using our database functions. Now, notice this is pretty complex criteria. This is, hey, find any date that's in the first quarter, right? Greater than or equal to the lower, less than or equal to the upper, and then West, GG, and IAM product. Now, there is one last topic we need to consider for AND criteria, and it has to do with standard deviation. If we scroll down here, what if we needed to do a cross-tabulated table calculating standard deviation with 2 conditions? Well, D functions you just cannot copy through a range like this given the criteria setup. So in this case, we have to create an array formula that can filter out the values we don't need based on AND criteria, right? We can't just do the standard deviation function and highlight all of the sales numbers. We need to pick out only the sales numbers for each one of the intersecting cells that match the column header and the row header criteria. Well, we saw last video, video number 5, we did average gross profit for sales rep, and we did an array formula using the if function to filter out values. So we can do the same here. Equals stdev, and we're going to use the S one because this is sample data. And just like we did in video 5, we can't dump all of the numbers in here, so we want to filter them. We can use the if function. Now, here's the logical test. In last video, we did one array operation where we said, hey, particular column, are you equal to something? But we have 2 columns and 2 conditions here. It's no problem. The if can do this. We have to put the first column in, so that's region. And I'm going to ask the question, are any of you equal to Midwest? Now I need to lock this. When I copy to the side, I need it locked on the J column. But when I copy it down, it needs to move. The row needs to move to 88 and then 89. So I hit the F4 key 1, 2, 3 times. Now, if I were to highlight this and hit F9, it's too big to evaluate. But the resultant array just comes out with trues and falses. Now remember, we have two conditions, so watch what happens. I'm going to type a comma. It says, please give me the value of true. I cannot put the numbers in yet because I still have one other condition. If you still have conditions, this is where you put your second if function. We are nesting multiple if functions because we have multiple conditions or criteria. Now, as soon as you put an if function inside of an if function, this is an criteria. All right, so the logical test, we have to ask the question of the sales rep column. Are any of you equal to the column header? And I need to lock this going down across the row, but not across the column. Now we can type comma, and because we have no conditions left, now we can highlight the whole column, sales. Now the way it's going to work, and I'll look at a small example on one of the other sheets in just a moment, is anytime it sees a true here in the same position in the resultant array as it finds a true over here, only when there's true and true is the multiple if functions allowed to pick out the sales number. All right, so I'm going to close parentheses, close parentheses. Man, I have a lot of functions here. I wait till I see the black one, then I know I'm done. Inside of this number 1 will be a resultant array with only the sales numbers for each one of these conditions. All right, now this is an array formula. We don't have some product function. We don't have array constants, so we have to use the special keystroke to enter this Control Shift and Enter. I immediately look up to the formula bar. I see my curly brackets. I can double click and send it down and then copy it to the side. I go to the last cell, diagonally furthest one away, F2. And sure enough, it got all of the ranges right. I'm going to hit Escape because I don't want to get rid of that Control Shift Enter, so Escape. Now, I want to go look at a much smaller version here so we can step through what just happened there in that formula. And I'm going to click on the sheet Boolean. All right, here's a much smaller data set. We have sales rep, customer sales, and we want to calculate standard deviation based on GG and Amazon. We can see there's actually only 2 records that have GG and Amazon. All right, so here we go, equals STDEV, and we're going to do the S one. And inside number 1, we put our first if, and I ask the question, hey, are any of you sales rep equal to GG, comma. We still have a condition left, so we have to put our second if. And our second question is of the customer column. Are any of you equal to Amazon? Now we do comma, value of true. We don't have any more and criteria conditions, so I put the sales column in. Now I can close parentheses, close parentheses, close parentheses until I see my black one. Control Shift Enter. I look up to the formula bar. I see my curly brackets. I know I've calculated it correctly. Now F2, and I want to do a little trick here to step through and look at this. I'm going to copy this formula in Edit Mode, Control C, and I'm going to come down below F2 and Control V. Now I want to evaluate certain parts of this, and I did it in the cell below because I'm going to leave the evaluations hard-coded in here so we can see how this is working. Logical test 1, I'm going to hit F9. Notice it gives me a resultant array of trues and falses. Now I'm going to go to the second logical test and the second if, F9 to evaluate it. And I'm going to go to value of true and evaluate the numbers too, so F9. Now I want to come to the beginning of the formula and type a space. Now I have this here as text, and I want to look at each one of these resultant arrays. So there's 1 and 2. It's only when it finds a true in the first one, and I'm going to Control B, and in the exact same position in the second one. When it finds a true in the second one, that means true, true. Then it's allowed to pick out in the values if true. So I'm going to bold that. Notice when it gets a true, that's the second one, and a false, it is not allowed to pick out that number. False, false, not allowed to pick out that number. It's not until the fifth true, and I'm going to control B. And if you look in the fifth position here, there's the fifth true. So the way AND criteria works when you have multiple ifs is it's only when it sees in the exact same position in the resultant arrays, true and true, is it allowed to pick out, in this case, the fifth number, control B. So when you have some aggregate calculation that doesn't have a built-in if function, you're totally allowed to string if functions together to do AND criteria. And it's only when it finds a true in the first resultant array and a true in the second resultant array in the same position is it allowed to pick out the number. So those are the only two numbers that then get dumped into standard deviation .s function. Now you could test this if we just use the standard deviation s and manually did this using a comma and getting that number 2, we can verify. Of course, for large data sets, you would never want to do it this way. But there we go. We get the same exact thing. There's some number formatting, making it look different. All right, so for AND criteria, for an AND logical test, sometimes we have to string together ifs. But of course, other times we can use built-in D functions. We might be doing between logical tests, which is a certain type of AND logical test. But most of the time, we're going to be using sum ifs, count ifs, or average ifs. All right, AND criteria. Now we want to go over to the sheet OR to talk about OR criteria. Now I want to jump over to our PDFs, and in the table of contents, I'm going to click on OR logical test and jump to that section. OR logical test using OR criteria. The goal of an OR logical test is to run 2 or more logical tests and see if at least one logical test evaluates to true. So if we had 2 tests and one of them comes out true and the other one false, the OR logical test would say true to this situation because there's at least one true. The OR logical test would say true here also because there's at least one true. Only when we get both falses will the OR logical test report a false. Notice true, true, that's going to be OK because that's at least one true. So in this first situation, we got 1 true. Second situation, we got 1 true, 0 trues, and 2 trues. Now we want to jump back over to Excel, and we're on the sheet OR. Now here's our same data set we used for our AND criteria calculations. Now we want to look at OR logical tests and OR criteria. I'm going to do the same thing I did on the other sheet. I'm going to highlight the entire table, Control-Shift-Down arrow, and I'm going to name these columns with Control-Shift-F3. So remember, we only want the top row. So I'm going to uncheck left column and click OK. Now, something different happened because notice, if this column is named date and over here this column is named date, there is potentially a problem. But let's go look at our name manager, formulas, define names, name manager, or the keyboard Control F3. And what Excel does is, yeah, there's duplicate cost of goods sold, duplicate customers. But over here in the scope column, it says the first name you created, cost of goods sold, that is on the AND sheet. That's called the workbook scope. That name, if you type cost of goods sold into any formula, it's available in the entire workbook on any sheet. But when we create a second cost of goods sold name, this one has a worksheet scope. It's only going to be available on the OR sheet. We can see right here, OR. Now, there is an exception. If you type the sheet name exclamation point, then the define name cost of goods sold, then you can access this on any sheet. But it's rare that people want to do that. Most of the time, you define a universal workbook name and you use it everywhere. If you create a worksheet name, in general, use it only on the sheet, which is what we're going to do. All right, I'm going to click Close. Now, we want to talk about an OR logical test. Here's our customer group, and we need to do things like add up all the sales, count, calculate the average, and add a helper column that tells us true when the customer in the customer column is one of these customers. Now, the way an OR logical test will work is like this. We will ask a question of each customer in the customer column. That means for this record, we're asking the question, hey, customer, are you Amazon, or are you Microsoft, or are you Yahoo, or are you Google? Notice for any particular one, we have to ask those 4 questions. Now, in this particular OR criteria situation, since our criteria is operating on a single column, we're actually never going to get more than 1 true. If we asked of Costco, we'd get 4 falses. But when we get to Microsoft, we're only going to get 1 true. The other ones will be false. Now, let's start with the OR function. I'm going to click in the top cell, and just like the AND function equals OR, there are logical tests separated by commas. You can have up to 255. And for our first logical test, I'm going to say, hey, relative cell reference, customer for this record, are you equal to, and I'm going to click on Amazon, F4 to lock it, comma to get to logical 2, same customer again, are you equal to the next customer, Microsoft, and I'm going to hit F4, comma, logical 3, hey, customer for this record, are you equal to Yahoo, F4, comma, logical 4, same customer, are you equal to Google, and F4. Now I can close parentheses, Control, Enter, and double click and send it down. There is our helper column. All of these ones are false, right? Because none of those customers right there are in this list over here. Now, there is another way to do this kind of calculation that we'll learn next chapter when we discuss lookup functions. But when we're talking about OR criteria, that's the perfect function to illustrate how we're calculating with OR criteria, doing our OR logical test. Now, if we want to add or count, we learned last video, video number 5, that we can use SUMIFs and COUNTIFs with a function argument array operation. So I'm going to use the SUMIFs, and I want to add all of the sales for one of these customers. So sum range, sales. And notice for my dropdown, now I have workbook and worksheet. Now, I'm not going to select from this dropdown list, because watch what happens. It puts the workbook name, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to type out sale. Notice I get the range finder blue, and that's what I want. So I'm going to type a comma. Criteria range, I want customer. Now you can also, if you're on this sheet, if I highlight the customer column, Control Shift down arrow, Control backspace, it will put that color coding in. Now comma, the criteria 1 argument. This is where we do a function argument array operation. This is OR criteria. Anytime you put more than one item into criteria 1 for SUMIFs or COUNTIFs, we're saying, hey, is the customer Amazon or Microsoft or Yahoo or Google? Now, because I put 4 in there when I close parentheses, and if I highlight this and hit F9, we know that this delivers 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers. That's the total for Amazon, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Google. That resultant array, we don't want to leave that, so Control Z. We put that not into sum, because if we use the sum function, we'd have to use Control Shift Enter. I want to put it into sum product. That array 1 argument there is what we use when we need to add from an array calculation. So close parentheses, and I simply hit Enter, and there is our total. If we want to count, we can use COUNTIFs. Criteria range is simply customer, comma, and I'm going to put a function argument array operation with my OR criteria, close parentheses. If I highlight this and hit F9, gave it 4 conditions, so it spits out 4 counts. That's the count of transactions for Amazon, the count of transactions for Microsoft. Control Z, I need to add those counts to get the total count, so I put it in sum product, close parentheses, and Enter. So there are the total sales and count using OR criteria on a single column. Now, when we get to calculating average, we can't do that because if we do a function argument array operation for average, it'll spit out 4 averages, and we can't average those. When you're doing an average, you need to add up every one of the actual numbers for each one of the either Amazon, Microsoft, Yahoo, or Google, and then count and divide by the count. So we can't use a function argument array operation here. Not only that, but when we come down here and we're going to see how to do an OR logical test and ask a question of the sales rep column and the customer column, notice that means we'd be asking a question 2 separate columns. You cannot do a function argument array operation here either. So for both of these situations, we're just going to use the regular old average function and put the if inside of it and make an array operation. Now, I want to go over to the sheet Boolean, so I'm going to click on that sheet. Now, here's a small data set, and I want to ask this OR question. Hey, customer, are you Amazon or are you Google? Now, what I need to do is get 1, 2, 3 items, and from the sales column, only get these 3 values and put them into the average function. Now, earlier in this video, we saw standard deviation with 2 if functions. In last video, we did aggregate calculations with the if function. But here, we want to use the average. And in the number 1, we want to filter those values. But guess what? We actually do have 2 questions using OR criteria. But we can't put an if and then a second if. When you string together or nest if functions like we did for our standard deviation calculation, that's using AND criteria. No problem. We can use if, and then in the logical test, we can actually put both questions, both array operations right in this logical test. That means I'm going to put this column 2 times into the logical test and compare it to each one of these. First, I have to isolate each array operation since there's going to be 2 with parentheses. So I highlight customer column, and I say, hey, are any of you equal to Amazon? Now I close parentheses. And the math operator we use for OR logical tests or OR criteria is the plus symbol. It's addition. And then we put, notice we're still in the logical test argument. We put open parentheses in our second column. It's the same column, but we list it twice. But this time we're asking, are any of you equal to Google? Now I close parentheses. And in the logical test, what will happen is we're never going to get a true and a true in the same position of the 2 resultant arrays. So we're only going to get situations, and you can see down here, if I were to evaluate all of this, you could see I can get true. This is the first array right here. I get a true for Amazon, and then boop, boop, boop. The 4th true is for the 4th Amazon. But when I add it, this second resultant array is asking the question about Google. So you can see over here, it's only in the second position. So in the second array of trues and falses, there's only a true there. Now when I add, I'm going to get true plus false, which is 1. False plus true, which is 1. And then the third position, look, a false and a false. So I get a 0. That's the trick to doing OR logical tests inside an aggregate function inside of if. Now here's our screen tip. Let's just go ahead and click on this and evaluate it with the F9 key. Sure enough, 1s and 0s. Now the if function logical test has no problem. Any non-zero number is interpreted as true. 0 is the only number that is interpreted as false. Control Z. Now I come to the end. Comma. And the value if true, those are the numbers that I want to filter. Now I can leave the last argument off. If I leave it off, then falses are inserted into that resultant array. Close parentheses. Now in the number 1, there's our if. And when I hit F9, you've got to be kidding me. It totally filtered and gave us only the values that match our OR criteria logical test. Now I need to Control Z, come to the end, close parentheses. I see my black parentheses, and this definitely is an array formula. There's our array operation. None of the functions are sum product, and I don't see array constant, so we have to use Control Shift and Enter. If you look up into the formula bar, we can verify. Sure enough, our curly brackets got put in. Now, we could verify this on a small data set to kind of prove to ourselves that this is working average, and I can simply manually click on the first one, type a comma, click on the second one, type a comma, click on the third one, close parentheses, and enter. You would never want to do this on a big data set. Now, that's OR criteria on the same column where we needed to do the array formula because average ifs wouldn't calculate a correct average for us. Hey, here's a second situation where the same formula will work. I'm asking two questions of two different columns. I'm saying, hey, is there a sales rep Gigi in the sales rep column, or is there a customer Amazon in the customer column? Now, we can just do our average, and right inside number one, we'll use the if function to filter out the values we don't want. The if, and we'll do the same exact construction. In parentheses, I ask the first column, are any of you equal to Gigi? Close parentheses, and I do the math operator plus symbol for OR criteria. Open parentheses. I highlight the second column, and I ask the question, are any of you equal to Amazon? Close parentheses. Now, the difference between this situation is that we have two columns. And you can clearly see that if I'm running two array operations here, in the first position, I'm going to get a true for Gigi and a true for Amazon. So I get two trues. If I were to evaluate the logical test argument here, and if I click on it and hit F9, sure enough, there's my at least one. I got two trues for the first item in each array, one because I got a Gigi but not an Amazon, a 0 because I did not get Gigi or Amazon, and so on. And remember, the logical test argument, and for that matter, and functions, or functions, the logical functions in Excel interpret any non-zero number as true, and 0 is the only number that gets interpreted as false. Control Z. Now I have my logical test, comma, and the value. If true, I simply highlight the values. I leave false out because I want false inserted to help filter out the values. I'm going to click on number one. There it is. Hit the F9 key, and sure enough, there is our array of numbers matching only the numbers for sales rep Gigi or customer Amazon. The false filtered out the two values we did not need. Control Z, come to the end, close parentheses. There's no sum product. There's no array constant, so we hold Control Shift and Enter. I look up to the formula bar. I see my curly brackets. I'm good to go. Now let's go back over to the sheet OR. So when we're calculating average sales for the customer group here, 4 different customers, I'm just going to use the average function. And then the if. Now this is going to be wild because in this logical test, I have to put 4 array calculations separated by a plus symbol. Each time I'm asking, is anyone in the customers column, are you equal to? And in this case, it is Amazon. Now I'm going to do a little trick here. I'm going to close parentheses and plus. I do not want to type this out. So I'm going to click on logical test, Control C, and then very carefully click right after the plus and Control V, V, V. I have 4 of them now. I double click the K and say, hey, that one's got to be Microsoft. Double click the K9, that one's got to be Yahoo. Double click the K9, that's got to be Google. I'm going to get rid of that plus at the end. Wow, that is wild. I can't evaluate this because it's too big for a cell with a formula, but there it is. Comma, value of true. Now I need sales. And I want to leave that value if false, so I close parentheses. That whole number 1 right there will give me a filtered column with sales numbers that match our OR conditions or criteria. Close parentheses and Control Shift and Enter. We immediately look up the formula bar, and there are our curly brackets verifying that we entered it as an array formula. So there it is. 5,109. That's the average sales for this customer group. Now, whereas this array formula doing an OR logical test only looked at a single column, the customer column, we are allowed to ask an OR logical test question of two different columns. We're going to ask the question, hey, how many transactions had a sales rep Gigi and a customer Amazon? Now we use a very similar construction, equals average. We don't want the whole sales column. We want to filter it, so we put the if function. In the logical test, we need to use that plus symbol for our OR logical test. Open parentheses, and the first column is going to be sales rep. And I'm going to ask the question, hey, are any of you equal to Gigi? Close parentheses. There's our plus. Open parentheses. And now I need customer. Are any of you equal to Amazon? Close parentheses. We have our two questions which will evaluate to true and false. The plus will add them, and the resultant array will be 0 for false. 1 because we found only one of them, or 2 because we found both of them. Logical test argument will interpret 1 and 2 as true and 0 as false. Come to the end, close parentheses, and value of true, that's the entire sales column. Now, value of false, we leave that out when we do in close parentheses. A false will be put in when the conditions are not met. And now, average number one argument has its filtered list of values to match the criteria. Close parentheses. This is an array formula. We have to use Control, Shift, and Enter. We immediately look up to the formula bar. We see our curly brackets. We're good to go. And there it is. The average sales for sales rep Gigi or customer Amazon was $4,958 and 90 some odd pennies. All right, now let's go look at our last example for OR condition or criteria. D functions. We saw D functions for AND logical test and criteria, but here we want to see OR criteria. Now, actually, if we have the field name and the same customer group here, our formula is going to be a lot easier. If we go back and look up here, these formulas are going to be a lot harder than the D functions. Now, if it's true that you have a report that says customer group 1 and you need that there, not the field name, then you're going to have to do these formulas. And if you're taking these formulas and copying them, then you're probably going to be stuck with these formulas. But if you have a single cell calculation you want to make for total sales, average sales, counting, standard deviation, or whatever, D functions are the ticket when it comes to OR criteria. Now here we want total sales, so I'm going to say equals D sum. Now we need our database. Control Home, and I'm going to highlight the proper data set with the field names, Control Shift down arrow, Control backspace. There's our database, comma. The field, I need to tell the dsum function which of those columns I'm going to make a calculation upon. I'm going to put the name of the field in double quote sales. You could also put the relative position 7, comma. And here's where OR criteria is great. That criteria needs the field name, and you simply put OR criteria on different rows. And boom, when I close parentheses and enter, that is a lot easier than that SUMIF SUM product formula. Now F2, I'm actually going to cheat for our next calculation, average. I'm going to copy the database, the field, and the criteria area, Control C, because the only thing we have to change is equals D average. Tab and Control V. D average will calculate the average for this customer group. And that is a lot easier than our average array formula we had to do when I hit Enter. Boom, there it is, 5,109. Now counting, I'm going to count on the customer column, so I'm going to use D counta. There's the same database, the field. I'm going to count on customer, comma, and the criteria, field name and OR criteria, each on a different row. Close parentheses and enter. There's our 688. Now, this OR logical test had criteria looking at a single column. We are allowed to use OR criteria on multiple columns. But for D functions, you have to be sure. If you're saying, please find GG sales rep or Amazon customer, you have to be sure and put it on different rows. But you have to have an empty cell that says, yes, you're looking for GG sales rep, but anything else is OK. Or you're looking for Amazon, and the empty cell here means anything in the sales rep column is OK as long as it's a customer Amazon. So we have the criteria area set up equals dcounta. We have our same database, comma. It doesn't matter which field because they both have text. Counta will count text, comma, and the criteria area. The two different columns in the OR criteria, including those empty spaces, on different rows. Close parentheses, and there is our count. So OR criteria for OR logical test, we can definitely do it with D functions. And if it's a single cell calculation, you're not copying it, and you have field names in a proper data set, that is the way to go. We can definitely do some array calculations for OR averaging and our sum product sum ifs and sum product count ifs for counting and adding. Now, we want to go over to the sheet and an OR function. I'm going to click on this sheet because we got to talk about accounts receivable department when we have to analyze various customers' credit worthiness. Now, we're going to look at 3 different rules, and here they are. Each one has a different logic, and so it will help us to see different ways we can use AND and OR functions. Rule number 1, we will extend credit if the customer sales last year are greater than our hurdle of $25,000, and their asset value is greater than the hurdle of $300,000, and the credit rating 1 is greater than or equal to 3. Rule number 2, at least one of the credit ratings is exceeded. So we look at each credit rating, and if one of them exceeds our limits, exceed means bigger than 3, bigger than 7, then we extend credit. And finally, rule 3 is the most complex. We have to check for sales greater than $25,000 and asset value greater than $300,000 and late payments less than 2, and at least one of the credit hurdles is exceeded. All right, let's start with number 1. We're going to start right here. Well, 3 conditions all have to be met. Perfect use for the AND function. And logical test, I'm asking the question for this customer, relative cell reference, are the sales last year greater than $250,000? And I'm going to lock that with the F4 key. That's logical 1. Comma, logical 2, hey, relative cell reference for the customer's asset value is that greater than our hurdle of $300,000. Now we have to lock that with the F4 key. Finally, we have to look at credit rating 1 greater than or equal to our hurdle of 3. F4 on that. Now we have our 3 logical tests. Close parentheses. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Only when all 3, yes, greater than 250,000, yes, greater than 300,000, and yes, greater than or equal to 3. Now that's rule number 1. Rule number 2, this is at least one of the credit ratings. Well, we're used to that phrase by now. When we say at least, that means or. So I'm going to say or. Logical test 1, I'm looking at credit rating 1, relative cell reference. And this says exceeds. I have to use greater than, click on the hurdle, F4. And there's a second test, comma, relative cell reference for credit rating 2. Are you greater than our hurdle of 7? F4, close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Well, clearly false means they both came out false. So this is not bigger than 3, and 7 is not bigger than 7. But this one, we got 2 trues. Here we got a false, but here we got a true. So our formula is working. In each case, I made a grave error there. I need to come down to the bottom and verify. Yes, indeed, the relative cell references are all in the correct place, and our lock cell references on the hurdles are in the correct place. I'm going to come over here, F2. Sure enough, 1, 2 relative cell references, and the hurdles are locked. Now, rule number 3, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 and logical tests. Now, this last one, at least one of the credit ratings is exceeded. That means that in the 4th logical test for AND, we're actually going to have to use this whole thing. Remember, the purpose of OR and functions is to deliver a single true or false. So this is perfectly all right to put inside one of the logical test arguments in and. I'm actually going to copy this in edit mode and escape. We'll paste it when we get to that last argument. So you ready? Equals and tab. Logical test. I need to check if relative cell reference, the customer's last year's sales, exceed or greater than our hurdle of 250,000. I'm going to hit the F4 key. Comma, logical 2. I have to check asset value, relative cell reference. Are you greater than our hurdle? F4 to lock it. Comma, logical test 3. I have to look at late payments last year for the customer. That's a relative cell reference. And that has to be less than our hurdle of 2. F4. Finally, comma, logical test 4. I'm simply going to Control V. Remember, OR is simply delivering a true or false, and that's what each one of these logical arguments need. All right, I'm going to come to the end very carefully. Close parentheses. There are 4 logical tests inside that and. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Now we come down to the last cell and hit F2, and look at that. That is amazing. And we could verify, right? So here's a true. That one exceeds. That one exceeds. This one is less than the 2, and at least one of these credit ratings has been passed. So that and function got 4 trues, and then and deliver a true to the cell. Now here's rule 3. And that's the rule we're going to use. And we would actually like, instead of true and false, we don't want to see Boolean values. We want to see credit or no credit. Anytime we have a column with a bunch of cells, and in each cell I want to put one of 2 things, that's the perfect job for the if function. Now the logical test, guess what? I already have the rule right here. Comma, the value if true, in double quotes, I'm going to type credit, in double quotes. Comma, and the value if false, in double quotes, no credit, in double quotes, close parentheses. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell, hit F2, and sure enough, that is working. Now, if this was our goal here and we didn't need any of this, we can simply notice that that cell is looking in I11. So if we go look at what's in I11, it's perfectly all right for us to now copy this. And this is a big little and or construction. Copy it, Control-C, escape. Come over here, F2, double-click that cell reference, and Control-V. Notice I didn't get the equal sign. That whole and or logical construction that defines our rule number 3 for extending credit is now sitting in the logical test. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Now I can highlight all of this, and if I remove it, this is working fine. Now I'm going to click Escape, Control Z. In fact, if you ever have to build a formula like this, you do want to build it in little pieces and then mash it all together, and then finally mash it all together here so we have one big formula. Enter. So and or conditional calculations are great for this type of accounts receivable credit analysis. Now we want to go look at our next topic on the if-is sheet. I'm going to click on this, and we want to talk about is functions. Now is functions deliver a true or false depending on what is actually in the cell. The is text, as you can imagine, delivers a true when it sees text. If it's not text, like if it's a number, it returns a false. Is number. It sees a number, it delivers true. Anything that's not a number delivers a false. Is logical. Only when it sees a logical value, a Boolean true or false, does it deliver true. Otherwise, it delivers false. Is blank. That function should have been called is empty, because what it does is if it sees an empty cell, it delivers a true. Anything else, it delivers a false. Now there's is error, and is NA. Is error will deliver a true for any error it sees. Is error delivers an error for any value except NA. Sometimes it's important to find other errors besides NA, because NA means not available. There is NA, which, as you can imagine, delivers a true when it sees an NA. Anything else is false. Is non-text, and even is a formula. Notice it says true, so we know there's a formula there. Now let's look at a bank example. We have 3 examples that will combine if and is blank, is number, and is text. Here's the checkbook. We have date, the check number or transaction number, a description, and what we're adding and subtracting from our starting balance. Now what we would like is I would like a formula that calculates the balance, and I want to be able to copy it down. If there's nothing entered for this particular transaction, I want nothing to show up in the cell. But as soon as I enter something, I want the formula to calculate. All right, now we're going to start with just the balance part of our formula. I'm going to say equals relative cell reference. I'm always looking at the balance above. And I'm going to add from the addition column and subtract from the subtraction column. Those are relative cell references that will work all the way down. And notice, normally we're having either a subtraction or an addition. But this balance formula will work even if we had numbers in both. Control Enter. And I'm going to copy it down. Now we can see it works for the transactions where we've already entered data. But down here, I don't want these to show up unless we enter data. So that's where the if and is will come in handy. I'm going to hit F2. We're going to use the if function because I'm either going to have the if put the formula in, or it's going to put the syntax for show nothing, which is double quote, double quote. So we have one of 2 things, and that's a perfect job for the if function. But in order to determine which of the 2 things to put in the cell, we need a logical test. Now, you get to decide when you're building the template, how do you want to build that logical test? There's at least 5 or 6 or 7 different ways to do this. Well, let's try is blank. Now remember, is blank looks for empty cells, so I'm going to click on relative cell reference, the date for this transaction, close parentheses. That means when I copy this formula down, when it gets to here, it gets a true, true, true. Right now, is blank, because this cell is not empty, will get a false. So comma, the value if true. That's for when we get down to the remaining rows where there's not a transaction. I want to use the syntax for show nothing, which is double quote, double quote. Now, double quote is really a 0-length text string. It is considered text, but it's what we use to show nothing, comma. Otherwise, the value if false, we're going to put the formula into the cell. Now I come to the end, close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. And sure enough, look at that. Now if I come down here and put today's date, look at that. Now notice the if function did its job. It actually ran and calculated the formula result. Right here, it's not running the formula. It's actually dumping this 0-length text string. We could actually come over here and test this. Equals is number. And notice right here it'll say true, but right here it'll say false because it's seeing something that's not a number. Hey, guess what? We could also use the is text. I'm going to say is this text. This will come out false, but watch this. Even though it looks like there's nothing there, now we have a method of determining what's actually in the cell, and it is. It's a 0-length text string. Now, I'm going to delete this right here, delete these. And now let's try to do that same formula, but from a different point of view. I'm going to say if, and our logical test, instead of saying are you empty, I could just as easily say are you a number. Now notice we know that dates are numbers, so that will work. But if this is a number, what do we want? Comma for the value if true. We actually want the formula. So notice this is from a slightly different point of view, but the formula will give us the same results. I'm going to add the addition column, subtract the subtraction column, comma. Otherwise, double quote to show nothing. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Now, when we come over here and enter a date, there we go. Control Z. We could still do this from another point of view. Equals if, and I'm going to say is text. Now, I need to pick a column that I'm always going to use. I'm going to always put text and some number in this column, so it is always going to be text. All right, there we go. Close parentheses. That'll give me true or false. If it's true, it means I've entered something here, so I want the formula for adding and subtracting. Add, subtract. That's the value of true. Otherwise, double quote, close parentheses. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Now watch this. When I come and put a date, notice these two are working, but this one is operating off the check number transaction column. So it's not until I put that one shows up. Now, how do you know which one of these to use? Well, you got to pick a column that's always going to have something. I usually think that the date is one of the most important things. Yes, there's always going to be a number, but we don't know which column. But dates for historical transactions like this, you always got to have a date there. So that's a good one. This is probably a good one too, unless you're going to enter text dates. If it's really the most important one is this one, and you're always going to enter text, then perhaps you want to use this one. So that's a little fun with if and is functions for conditional calculations. Our calculation here was putting either text to show nothing or running a formula. All right, now we want to go over to the sheet pivot table or formula. Hey, our last topic, since we've been doing a lot of formulas with conditional calculations in this video. When do you use formulas? When do you use pivot tables? Now, back in video 3, we did a bunch of pivot tables with lots of conditions and criteria. Here's some general guidelines. Really, for formulas, if the solution needs to instantly update when formula inputs or source data changes, then formulas are usually preferable. So for example, this is a pretty complicated formula. This pivot table is easy to create. But if the data changes to 225, enter, that instantly updates. It's no problem. Pivot tables, you just have to right-click refresh, and it instantly updates. But sometimes Control-Z, Z, but sometimes you want that instant update, and formulas give that to you. If you're making aggregate calculations with many criteria and you don't need the solution to instantly update, then of course pivot tables are preferable. Now there are many more functions in an Excel spreadsheet than there are in a pivot table, so that's another consideration. Pivot tables only do aggregate calculations. Hey, for big data, formulas calculate slowly. We saw back in video number 3, the Power Pivot data model with pivot tables could deal with a lot of big data. Pivot tables are easy. Hey, this monthly report is much easier than that big formula. But sometimes it's easier to create your solution with formulas, and sometimes it's easier with a pivot table. Clearly, this type of calculation and some of the pivot tables we did earlier in the class are much easier than formulas. Let's go look at a situation here on the sales team. Here's that OR criteria formula. This is a little bit easier to create one formula, copy it down and over, because for a pivot table, you'd have to do 4 different pivot tables and then filter each one. All right, this was an epic video about making calculations with conditions or criteria. We talked about some comparison between pivot tables and formulas. We talked about if and is functions. We talked about the and or functions for accounts receivable credit analysis. We talked about on the or sheet all sorts of different ways to calculate when we have an or logical test. And on the and sheet, we started off talking about and logical